So we've seen the cartoon about Rehoboam, and if you haven't seen the cartoon about Rehoboam, I want you to watch that first. So turn this off and go back to that. Watch the cartoon about Rehoboam. And once you've done that, then so we know how the nation of Israel formed. There were 12 tribes that invaded the promised land of Canaan. The first king of those 12 tribes, which was a long time after they invaded, but the first king was King Saul.
Kill David.
And then after King Saul, we
Kill
have
David.
King David.
I am David.
And then David's son, Solomon.
Vapor, vapor, all is vapor.
And then Solomon's son, Rehoboam,
What's up, dude?
made the people angry at him, and there was a partition that happened, and the one half of the partition was called Israel, and they were the north kingdom, and that was the 10 tribes. And then there was Judah in the south, and that was the tribe of Judah, and sometimes Benjamin as well. Really, Benjamin was really a part of it because they were right next to each other. The city of Jerusalem is in Judah, and we have the word Jew comes from Judah. That's where we get the word Jew from. And the people who lived in Judah, they had a king who came from David. So that they believed the promises that David was the promised line of the Messiah. And so they wanted that. And so they had always a descendant of David, except for one person, which we'll talk about. We have a whole video about her. But now we have Judah in the south with a king from David, a Davidic king, we call that. And in the north, we have Israel. Now, the people of Israel, as you saw in the video, they followed Jeroboam.
Jeroboam.
And he became their king. And you saw that at first what happened was he was going to follow the Lord, but didn't last long because he saw people wanting to go to Jerusalem, and that's in the south. Remember? Judah, Jerusalem, J, Judah, Jerusalem. And then the north of Israel, their capital is Samaria. The people wanted to go to Jerusalem because that's where the temple was. But if they started doing that, Jeroboam knew that they would want to rejoin Judah. But Judah's the enemy, and he wants them to stay the enemy. And so what he does is he said, let's make our own temples. And here you have the story of the northern kingdom of Israel. That's all they do, is they worship idols. And they worship the worst idols. And what happens over time as they continue to worship these idols, Dagon, Molech, Asherah, Baal, as they worship these idols and they serve these idols and they follow the idols, what happens is that they do terrible practices, but they're still God's chosen people. Okay? They still are under the law of God. They still, although they don't obey it, they still have all of those promises, all the promises that God made to Abraham. Go to the people in the northern kingdom, even though they're living in rebellion. And all of the promises that God made to Jacob and Isaac, all the promises God made to Moses, it's true for the people in the northern kingdom, even though they're in rebellion against God. So it's important to remember that the promises are still there. Now, those people in the northern kingdom who lived in such rebellion, God didn't destroy them right away, even though I would have, but God has so much love and has such a brilliant, perfect plan. He wanted to wait until the exact right moment. And when that right moment came, 200 years, 210 years after they started, God sent the armies of Assyria, and the Assyrians conquered the Jews living in the northern kingdom and took them into exile. And so that means that the land no longer belonged to God's chosen people. Israel lasted for 200 years, but Judah lasted for a good while after that. And so we have good kings and bad kings in Judah, but all bad kings in the northern kingdom of Israel.